Hello, my fellow weirdlings. It's Margot, and today I'm bringing you more stories of encounters with the mysterious men in black. So if you're ready for something perplexing and unsettling, keep watching. In my last video about the men in black, I told you about some of the most notable encounters on record, the ones that really shaped the lore of the men in black in mainstream consciousness. This time, I want to talk about some of the lesser publicized encounters, which are no less intriguing. But first, here's a brief refresher on who or what the mysterious men in black are assumed to be. The men in black are usually described as strange, eerie, or off-putting gentlemen in dark suits, who tend to show up after a UFO sighting, ostensibly to intimidate witnesses into staying silent or doubting what they saw. They sometimes arrive in dark-colored sedans. At other times, they seemingly appear out of nowhere and then vanish without a trace. They often make vague claims of working for the government. They're usually described as very pale, sometimes very tall or thin, and often completely hairless. They sometimes appear to have painted-on lips with no actual lips underneath. But earlier descriptions of men in black tend to portray them as small in stature, with Asian features. This could reflect how the historical perception of Asians as unassimilable aliens within America led to these associations. But that's a topic for another day. Nobody really knows who the men in black are or where they came from. But there are many theories, from covert government agents to aliens, to figments of the imagination. One thing every men in black encounter seems to have in common is that they leave their witnesses feeling shaken to their core, and they never forget that feeling. These are a few of those stories. When we think of strange West Virginia happenings that have captured the world's curiosity, what usually comes to mind are the bizarre Mothman sightings of Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the mid-1960s. Those sightings were accompanied by reports of hauntings, enhanced psychic abilities in ESP, and sightings of other cryptids, along with encounters with UFOs and the infamous men in black. But even before that, nearby Braxton County, West Virginia, had developed its own reputation as a hub of weird activity. Back in 1952, there were a few reported sightings of what came to be known as the Flatwoods Monster, which many believe today to have been an alien creature from a downed UFO. Well, those who don't believe it to have been an aggressive barn owl anyway. It was described as a 10-foot-tall monster. Afterward, two men reportedly appeared in Braxton County posing as peddlers. They systematically visited the homes of most of the witnesses, showing little interest in selling pots and pans, but anxious to talk about the monster sightings for hours. Those sightings resulted in a strongly worded letter, allegedly from the Pentagon, to a witness named Kathleen May, and some strange conversations with those traveling peddlers. Could they have been men in black in disguise? Maybe. But a much earlier experience in Braxton County may have actually been the first encounter with the men in black in recorded history. Ufologist and author John Keel extensively covered the Mothman phenomenon and wrote several books discussing it. Keel himself was reportedly harassed by the men in black, and his writings on the topic were instrumental in bringing the men in black into public consciousness. In his 1978 book, The Cosmic Question, Keel relates the story of a retired newspaper reporter named John Cole, as told to him by Cole in 1967. Cole was a resident of Weston, West Virginia, who covered the local news. In May of 1924, Cole was called out to investigate the site of a possible airplane crash near a small town named Gem in Braxton County. A farmer had witnessed an aircraft crash into a forest. At that time, planes were a very rare sight, especially in rural West Virginia, so a crashing plane was really big news. According to the farmer, the plane was really odd. It didn't make any noise, didn't have any wings, and was, as he described it, as big as a battleship. A search party was formed which included the local sheriff, John Cole, and several other local men, some carrying guns. They systematically searched the woods, and within hours the wreck was located in a small clearing. According to Cole, quote, "We weren't the first ones there, though. There were already 5 or 6 men in the clearing. Some of them were dressed in black business suits, neckties and all, and that seemed damn silly in that neck of the woods. He said that others were dressed in coveralls of a funny color, made of some kind of very shiny material. They were talking among themselves in a rapid-fire foreign language when the search party came upon them. Cole said the men in coveralls got really agitated when they saw the search party and ran into the wreck as if to hide. Cole described the downed aircraft as having the fuselage of a modern plane, with windows and all, but it didn't look to him like it would be able to fly. It didn't have any wings, tail, or propellers. As the farmer had described, it was pretty big, at least 75 feet long, filling the whole clearing. One of the men in the search party said to Cole, "By God, they're spies," and raised his gun in the direction of the strange men. The strangers were all described as small, just over 5 feet tall, with vaguely Asian features. No specific Asian ethnicity was specified. High cheekbones, almond eyes, and olive skin. This is a recurring description in reports of early Men in Black sightings. One of the suited men spoke English. He told Cole and the other men that nobody was hurt and everything was all right. He said he'd call the sheriff later and file a detailed report. Since there wasn't much the sheriff and the search party could do at that point, with no crime committed and no reported injuries, they headed home. Cole said that while he was standing there looking around, he spotted a, as he said, little metal thingamajig on the ground. Without really knowing why, he picked it up and put it in his coat pocket, deciding to keep it. Once he got home, he found himself exhausted from the day's hike and went straight to bed. At about 3 a.m., Cole was awoken by someone pounding on his front door. He found an army officer standing there, dressed in one of the broad-brimmed hats and leg wrappings they used to wear. Cole said it was definitely a U.S. Army uniform, but the man looked just like those foreigners from the strange aircraft, though maybe a little taller. The man said to him, "You picked up something today. We need it back." Being half asleep, Cole couldn't immediately think of what the man would be talking about. Then he remembered the metal thingamajig, still sitting in his coat pocket. Bringing it to the officer, he said, "Is this what you mean?" The man grabbed the thingamajig and walked off without a word. He didn't seem to have any form of transportation. Cole went back to bed, but the next day he had questions. For one, how had the officer tracked him down at his home in Weston? A couple days later, he went back to the clearing in the woods. It was completely empty. The only sign left of the crash was the crushed foliage where the aircraft had landed. After his 3 a.m. military visit, Cole assumed it was some sort of secret army experiment and decided to leave it alone. Now I'll jump ahead to 1950, and a story that was told to Shern Larson of the Center for UFO Studies in about 1974 by the then-adult son who experienced it. In 1950, an unnamed Presbyterian minister and his young son visited the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois. According to the son, they became lost in a labyrinth of corridors and eventually found themselves in a room with a large case containing small humanoid bodies. He said his father was instantly grabbed by several men and forced to sign papers before they were allowed to leave. I'm not sure if this was technically a Men in Black experience, since I couldn't find a description of the men they encountered, but it's an interesting story. I will say the Men in Black must have been kept really busy in the 1950s, a period when there was an apparent explosion of UFO sightings all around the world. In 1951, near Key West, Florida, several naval officers and crew spotted a cigar-shaped object hovering over the water. Then a fighter plane appeared and the strange object flew off, vanishing in seconds. As soon as they were back on land, the witnesses were surrounded by men in dark suits. They were held and questioned for hours, in a way that the sailors described as seeming more aimed at discrediting them than anything else. This story was covered by John Keel in his book The Cosmic Question, and the only source was an anonymous letter in a Miami newspaper. I couldn't find anything else about it. In 1952, a 53-year-old mailman named Carlo Rossi spotted a strange, disc-shaped object hovering just above the water while fishing on the Serchio River near Vico, Italy at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll give you more details on that in a bit. 6 days later, Rossi was fishing again at the same spot when he was approached by a tall, thin man he'd never seen before. He described the man as having a very angular face, with gray eyes and a penetrating gaze. He carried an oddly short cane and was wearing a dark blue suit which gave him the appearance of a soldier. The man asked Rossi if he'd seen a plane or some other flying thing above the river. Feeling oddly threatened, Rossi answered that he had not. He said the man spoke Italian, but with a strong accent, perhaps Scandinavian. The stranger offered Rossi a long cigarette of a brand he'd never seen before, with a gilded end. Rossi took a puff and immediately felt dizzy and nauseous. He was later quoted as saying, "Hardly had I sucked 2 puffs that I believed I was going to die." My head started to turn. I quickly withdrew the cigarette from my mouth, extinguished it, and slipped it into my pocket. But the man grabbed it brutally, broke it apart, and threw the remains in the river. Then he moved away, leaving me lying on the bank and almost dead. Still feeling quite ill, Rossi began to fear that someone had tried to silence him by giving him a bad cigarette. So he went to the public prosecutor's office in the town of Lucca and swore out a statement about his encounters with the UFO and the strange man. Years later, in the 1960s, Rossi was tragically killed by a hit-and-run driver while bicycling home one evening, leaving many to believe his death to have been an assassination related to his UFO sighting. This seems to be a common type of accident to befall people who've encountered the men in black. Later, Rossi's son Sergio and grandson Maurizio supplied this sketch of what Carlo Rossi's UFO looked like, according to Rossi's description. Rossi's grandson Maurizio also provided the description his grandfather had given to his family prior to his death. He said, quote, "The cupola was completely transparent, while the rest of the disc, including its legs and the ladder, were of a shining white material. When the people aboard the craft caught sight of my grandfather, a red light came on in the cupola, and at once beams of light were flashed at him. But he managed to avoid them by throwing himself down into the ditch at the foot of the embankment on which he was standing and observing the UFO. Immediately after, the UFO had risen up from the river, where it seemed to be drawing in water. The ladder and the legs, which were standing on the bed of the river, were at once taken in, and spinning at immense speed on its own axis, it shot up into the sky and vanished. As the disc was rising, my grandfather noticed that either the transparent cupola or the upper part of the disc, made of darker metal, seemed to be motionless, while on the other hand, the rest of the disc was spinning extremely fast, as though around a central pivot." End quote. Carlo Rossi claimed he'd watched the mysterious craft hover for about 10 minutes. This is an interesting case to me, not even so much due to the actual UFO and Man in Black encounters, but because of the way it's been reported on. Every UFO or Men in Black story has its skeptics. One reason people tend to doubt these stories is because the details don't always add up. In this case, I think that's partly due to shoddy reporting. As far as I can tell, 2 or 3 months after Mr. Rossi filed his report with the public prosecutor, the first news article was published about his experience. This article was written by a reporter who apparently had a reputation for being a prankster, embellishing stories or outright fabricating them. This is example 1 of shoddy reporting. There was even a sketch accompanying the article that Mr. Rossi's family later said was completely contrived by that newspaper. That sketch will soon be on your screen. As still happens today, other news outlets picked up the story and the sketch and basically just regurgitated the details as the original reporter wrote them. That's example 2 of shoddy reporting. The main detail that's really stood out to skeptics over the years, causing them to doubt the entire account, is that there were reportedly 5 propellers on the aircraft. The description of those propellers would render a craft both unable to fly and unable to be silent, as Mr. Rossi had claimed. Therefore, Mr. Rossi must have lied about the whole thing. According to the Rossi family, Carlo never stated that the craft had propellers. That was another fabrication from that initial reporter. Of course, the family could have changed the story to omit the propellers later. I don't personally know any of the people involved or their character, so I can't speak for anybody. I did see at least one direct quote attributed to Carlo Rossi, where he was speaking of 5 propellers and 3 rotors, but I have no idea how accurate the reporting was there either. When Mr. Rossi filed his report with the prosecutor's office on September 26, 1952, he claimed that he did not invent even one detail, and that his story was purely and simply the truth. For several weeks he did lengthy radio interviews and apparently maintained his story. Many years after the event, and after Carlo Rossi's death, an investigation was carried out which included interviews with Mr. Rossi's family members and others who knew him. I haven't seen proof, but it's widely believed that one of the investigators was a nephew of Carlo Rossi, who may have become interested in ufology specifically because of his uncle's experience. Skeptics argue that the family's current story edits that place the blame for its unbelievability on that one dishonest reporter could have stemmed from this nephew's efforts to make his uncle's story more believable after the fact. Many believe this whole story to be a journalistic hoax, but for what it's worth, people who knew Carlo Rossi claim his story remained consistent over the years, and that he was a sane, reliable man who wouldn't have made this up. Some have even theorized that Mr. Rossi could have seen a helicopter, which potentially could have been a UFO to him in 1952 Italy. Our final story for today took place in late 1953, and comes with a reminder to not believe everything you're told by charismatic people. Self-professed alien contactee George Adamski wrote, "I was visited by 3 men who direly threatened me, demanding certain papers I had for one thing. Some of these I gave them. I did not give them some of my important papers. There's no denying that I was frightened. Before they left, I was told to stop talking or they'd come after me, lock me up, and throw away the key." End quote. That's Adamski's story with an alleged encounter with the men in black, but there are serious doubts about his credibility. George Adamski was an author who became widely known in ufology and even in popular culture in the 1940s and 1950s for producing numerous photos of supposed alien spacecraft and multiple first-hand accounts of experiences with extraterrestrial life forms. Adamski even claimed to have taken flights to the moon and other planets with these friendly extraterrestrials, and many people believed him. When it came to all things ufology related, this guy was the man. Adamski called himself a philosopher, teacher, student, and saucer researcher, though nowadays he's mostly known as a charlatan, con artist, and hoaxer. By 1930, Adamski was teaching his personal blend of Christianity and Eastern religions, which he called Universal Progressive Christianity and Universal Law. He founded the Royal Order of Tibet in Laguna Beach, California, which held its meetings in the Temple of Scientific Philosophy, where Adamski did his philosophizing and teaching, among other more lucrative activities. I don't think I have to tell you that as a general rule, trusting self-proclaimed spiritual leaders is a bad idea. During Prohibition, Adamski's Royal Order of Tibet was given a government license to make wine for religious purposes. Adamski was quoted as saying, "I made enough wine for all of Southern California. I was making a fortune." When Prohibition ended in 1933 and winemaking became far less profitable, Adamski seemingly lost interest in his spiritual calling. He later told 2 friends that's when he, quote, "had to get into this flying saucer crap." That flying saucer crap gained him even more followers, who hung on his every word, and usually referred to him as Professor Adamski. Many still saw him as a prophet. He often implied or outright claimed to possess various academic degrees, though he reportedly only had a 3rd-grade education. These days, there have been investigations into Adamski's claims, and they've basically all been determined to have been hoaxes. His flying saucer pictures have been debunked by experts, including J. Allen Hynek, scientific consultant to the U.S. Air Force's Cold War-era UFO investigation team, Project Blue Book. Hynek described them as crude fakes. Despite the preposterousness of Adamski's stories, he became an international celebrity and lectured all over the world as an authority on UFOs. He was invited to the palace of Queen Juliana of the Netherlands and claimed to have had a secret 1963 meeting with Pope John XXIII. He also claimed that the Pope bestowed on him a Golden Medal of Honor, though skeptics couldn't help but notice it was just a common tourist shop souvenir displayed in a cheap plastic box. His photos were frequently featured in newspapers and magazines. He was often misidentified as a professional astronomer due to his physical proximity to the Palomar Observatory. In reality, he operated a tiny restaurant and campground just down the road, with a telescope in his backyard. In short, one of the loudest voices in ufology was nothing more than a celebrity cult leader and a fraud. But even the head of Project Blue Book, Edward J. Ruppelt, once dropped by Adamski's restaurant incognito and listened to him speak. Though he didn't believe a word of it, Ruppelt later said, "To look at the man and to listen to his story, you had an immediate urge to believe him. He had the most honest pair of eyes I've ever seen." George Adamski died in 1965 at the age of 74. Since his death, Adamski's critics have tended to portray him as a harmless crackpot, small-time con artist, or a bit of both. This may be true, but there are many others like him, hell-bent on gaining personal financial gain and even political power. People like Adamski also continue to discredit the entire field of UFO research. Remember, when it comes to exploring conspiracy theories like the Men in Black or any other, always keep an open mind, but employ critical thinking. Immersion in conspiratorial thinking can become dangerous for yourself and others. It can lead to paranoia, obsession, detachment from reality, and even violent behavior. It's not always easy or possible to recognize when you're too far into something to see your way out. Always take a step back from what you're doing and seek help if possible, if your loved ones show concern toward your behavior, or if you're having destructive or paranoid thoughts. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed this topic and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you've ever seen a UFO, I'd love to hear all about it. Thanks so much for watching.